The gunshot echoed through the valley as Josephine Faulkner scrambled up the rocky embankment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Colorado Territory, 1876, a place and time where a woman alone might as well have a target painted on her back. She clutched the deed to her father's land in her trembling fingers, the paper worth more than gold to the men pursuing her. Get that woman. The voice belonged to Victor Holloway, wealthy cattle baron with eyes on expanding his empire across the entire San Luis Valley. She can't have gone far. Josephine ducked behind a boulder, her breath coming in short gasps. 3 days ago, she'd been preparing dinner in her small cabin when Holloway's men had arrived with forged papers, claiming her father had sold the land before his death. When she'd refused to leave, they'd threatened to remove her by force. Now she was running for her life, her dark hair coming loose from its practical braid, her dress torn at the hem. The sound of horses approaching sent a chill down her spine. "Miss, over here." Josephine whirled around, ready to bolt, when she saw him, a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun, leading a horse toward her from a hidden draw in the hillside. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he wore the practical garb of a cowhand denim pants, leather vest over a simple shirt, and a bandana tied around his neck. "I don't have time to explain," he said in a low, urgent voice. "But those men are coming and they mean to do you harm. I can help." Josephine hesitated, weighing her options as the sounds of pursuit grew louder. "I'm Thomas Tucker," he said, extending his hand. "I work the Double T Ranch to the north." "I know who you are, Miss Faulkner, and I know what Holloway is trying to do." She had seconds to decide whether to trust this stranger. Something in his steady gaze convinced her, and she took his hand, allowing him to help her onto his horse. He swung up behind her and they were off, racing across the valley floor as the sun dipped below the mountains. "Hold tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse faster. They rode hard through stands of aspen and pine, fording a shallow creek before climbing into the foothills. Behind them, the shouts of Holloway's men faded into the distance. When Thomas finally slowed the horse to a walk, night had fallen. Stars glittered overhead in a velvet sky, and Josephine realized she was trembling from exhaustion and fear. "There's a line shack up ahead," Thomas said, his voice a reassuring rumble. "We'll be safe there for tonight." The small cabin was rustic but sound, used by cowhands during the seasonal cattle drives. Thomas lit a lantern, revealing a simple interior with a small stove, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face with concern. Josephine shook her head. "Just frightened and confused. Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Thomas removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a startling blue, clear and direct. "I know enough," he replied, stoking a fire in the small stove. "I know Holloway's been trying to buy up every piece of land in the valley, and I know he doesn't take kindly to refusal." He paused, setting a pot of coffee to boil. "And I know your father was a good man who wouldn't have sold that land for all the money in Denver." Josephine sank onto a bench, her legs suddenly weak. "My father loved that land. It was everything to him." "And now it's yours," Thomas said, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee, "which makes you a problem for Holloway." "They were going to force me out tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I refused to sign their papers, they said they'd come back with the sheriff, but when they returned, there was no law with them, just men with guns." Thomas's face hardened. "Holloway owns the sheriff in these parts, but he doesn't own everyone." "What am I going to do?" Josephine asked, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. "I can't go back, they'll just be waiting." "No, you can't go back, not yet." Thomas refilled her cup. "But you're not alone in this fight, Miss Faulkner. There are others who have been pushed around by Holloway, people who have had enough." Josephine studied him, this stranger who had risked himself to save her. "Why do you care what happens to me or my land?" A shadow crossed his face. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when men like Holloway get their way. My family had a small spread north of here. Holloway wanted it for water rights when my father refused to sell." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "What happened?" Josephine asked softly. "Our barn burned down." With our horses inside, my father died trying to save them. His voice was flat, but his eyes held old pain. That was 3 years ago. I've been working other people's cattle since then, biding my time. I'm so sorry, Josephine whispered. Thomas shook his head. The point is, you're not the first, and you won't be the last unless someone stands up to him. And that someone is you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maybe it's us. Josephine felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. I'm not sure what I could possibly do against men with guns. You've already done it. You've refused to be intimidated. That's more than most. Thomas checked the windows, drawing rough curtains across them. Get some rest, Miss Faulkner. You take the bed. I'll keep watch. Josephine, she said. Please call me Josephine. His smile was brief but warm. Josephine it is. Sleep came in fitful bursts for Josephine. Each time she woke, she found Thomas still vigilant, sometimes by the window, sometimes adding wood to the stove, but always alert. In the gray light of dawn, she rose and found him making a simple breakfast of beans and coffee. We need to move, he said without preamble. Holloway's men will be searching and they know these hills. Where will we go? She asked, accepting the plate he offered. My employer, Mr. Jenkins, owns the Double T. He's no friend of Holloway's. He'll help us. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Thomas was a quiet companion, but his presence was reassuring. He knew the land intimately, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the higher ground where they could see anyone approaching. By midday, they reached the Double T Ranch, a sprawling operation with a large main house, several outbuildings, and corrals filled with horses. Cattle dotted the distant pastures. As they approached, a wiry man with gray streaked hair emerged from the barn, hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. When he recognized Thomas, he relaxed. Tucker, didn't expect you back so soon. His shrewd eyes shifted to Josephine. And with company, no less. Mr. Jenkins, this is Miss Josephine Faulkner. She's in trouble. Jenkins's expression grew serious. Holloway? Thomas nodded. Well then, you'd better come inside. Inside the main house, Josephine explained her situation to Jenkins while his housekeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Winters, fussed over her torn dress and scratched hands. Your father was Edmund Faulkner? Jenkins asked, leaning forward in his chair. Yes, sir. He died last winter, pneumonia. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. I knew him slightly. Honest man, kept to himself. He glanced at Thomas. And now Holloway wants the land. It's the water, Thomas said. Faulkner's property controls access to the upper creek. If Holloway gets it, he controls water for half the valley. Jenkins's weathered face hardened. That man's appetite knows no bounds. He turned back to Josephine. You're welcome to stay here, Miss Faulkner. I've had my own run-ins with Holloway over the years. I don't want to bring trouble to your door, Josephine protested. Jenkins laughed, a short, sharp sound. Trouble's been knocking at my door for 40 years, young lady. I'm still here. That evening, after a proper meal, the first Josephine had eaten in days, Mrs. Winters showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom. There's a dress in the wardrobe that might fit you, the housekeeper said. It belonged to Mr. Jenkins's daughter before she moved to Denver. Thank you, Josephine said, touched by the kindness. For everything. Mrs. Winters patted her arm. Get some rest, dear, you're safe here. But as Josephine soon discovered, safety was a relative term in the Colorado territory. The following morning, she awoke to the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. Looking out her window, she saw a group of riders approaching, at least 10 men, with Holloway himself in the lead. She hurried downstairs to find Jenkins, Thomas, and several ranch hands already on the porch, rifles in hand. Stay inside, Thomas said when he saw her, his face grim. Jenkins stood at the top of the porch steps, his stance relaxed but his eyes cold as Holloway reined in his horse. Morning, Jenkins, Holloway called, his voice carrying across the yard. He was a large man with a florid face and expensive clothes, a businessman playing at being a frontiersman. I believe you're harboring a fugitive. Funny, Jenkins replied. I don't see any fugitives here, just guests and honest working folk. Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. The Faulkner woman stole legal documents and fled rather than face justice. Sheriff has a warrant for her arrest. From her position just inside the doorway, Josephine could see Thomas's hand tighten on his rifle. "That's so," Jenkins drawled. "And what documents would those be?" "The deed to her father's property," Holloway said smoothly. "Properly sold to me before his passing." "Strange," Jenkins said. "I heard Edmund Faulkner would rather have cut off his arm than sell to you." Holloway's face darkened. "Watch yourself, old man, the law's on my side." "Is it now?" Jenkins nodded toward one of the riders flanking Holloway, a thin man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Morning, Patterson. Tell me, does Judge Wilson know you're serving warrants based on forged documents these days?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Holloway's expression hardened. "I want that woman Jenkins now." "She's not here," Thomas spoke up, his voice steady. "And even if she were, we wouldn't hand her over to the likes of you." Holloway's gaze shifted to Thomas, his eyes narrowing. "You're that Tucker boy, aren't you? Still bitter about your daddy's bad luck with fire, I see." Thomas took a step forward, but Jenkins laid a restraining hand on his arm. "You're trespassing on my property, Holloway," Jenkins said coldly. "I suggest you leave before my men get nervous with these rifles." For a tense moment, it seemed Holloway might push the confrontation. Then he smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "This isn't over. That land will be mine, one way or another." He turned his horse. "Let's go, boys. We know where she is now." As they rode away, Josephine stepped onto the porch, her heart racing. "I've put you all in danger." Jenkins shook his head. "Holloway and I have been at odds for years. This is just one more round in an old fight. But he'll be back," she said, "with more men." "Yes, he will," Thomas agreed, his eyes still fixed on the retreating riders. "Which is why we need to act first." "What do you mean?" Josephine asked. Thomas turned to her, determination in his gaze. "We need to prove the deed Holloway's waving around as a forgery. And to do that, we need to find the original." "But I've searched everywhere," Josephine said. "My father kept all his important papers in a box under his bed. The deed wasn't there." "Did your father have any friends, anyone he might have trusted with important documents?" Jenkins asked. Josephine thought for a moment. "There was Mr. Finch, the assayer in town. They played chess together sometimes. And Reverend Powell, my father, attended services every Sunday." "Finch is honest enough," Jenkins mused, "but he's also frightened of his own shadow if Holloway pressured him." "Then we start with the Reverend," Thomas decided. "I'll take Josephine into town tonight after dark." Jenkins nodded. "Take the back trail. I'll have some of the boys create a distraction to draw off any of Holloway's men who might be watching the place." That evening, dressed in the borrowed clothes Mrs. Winters had provided, Josephine rode beside Thomas along a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest. The dress was simpler than her own, a practical blue calico suitable for a rancher's daughter, but it was clean and whole. "Do you really think Reverend Powell might have my father's deed?" she asked as they rode. "It's worth asking," Thomas replied. "Your father was a careful man by all accounts. He would have protected something that important." They traveled in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. "Tell me about your land," Thomas said eventually. "What makes it special to you?" Josephine smiled, memories warming her despite the cool night air. "Everything. The way the light hits the meadow in the morning, the creek where I used to swim as a girl, the old cottonwood where my father built me a swing." She paused. "After my mother died, that land became our whole world. He taught me everything there, how to fish, how to grow crops, how to read the weather." "You love it," Thomas observed. "It's all I have left of him," she said simply. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I understand that. After we lost our place, I felt rootless, like a tumbleweed blown wherever the wind took me." "Is that why you work for Jenkins, to stay close to home?" He nodded. "And to keep an eye on Holloway. I always knew our paths would cross again someday." They reached the outskirts of town well after midnight. The small settlement of Willow Creek was dark, most businesses closed except for the saloon, where light and music spilled onto the dusty street. Thomas led them to the small white church on the edge of town. Behind it stood a modest cabin, the Reverend's home. "Wait here," Thomas whispered, helping Josephine dismount. He approached the cabin cautiously and knocked softly on the door. After a long moment, a light appeared in the window. The door opened to reveal a thin, elderly man in a nightshirt holding a lamp. "Who's there?" he called, squinting into the darkness. "Reverend Powell, it's Thomas Tucker from the Double T. I've brought Josephine Faulkner to see you. We need your help." The Reverend's face cleared. "Miss Faulkner, come in, quickly. There's been men looking for you." Inside the small cabin, Reverend Powell lit more lamps and offered them seats at his kitchen table. His hands trembled slightly as he poured them each a cup of tea. "I feared the worst when I heard Holloway's men were hunting for you," he said to Josephine. "They've been telling everyone you stole documents and ran." "They're the thieves," Josephine said bitterly. "They tried to force me from my home with forged papers." The Reverend nodded gravely. "I never believed their story. Your father was my friend for 20 years. He would never have sold to Holloway." "Reverend," Thomas leaned forward, "did Edmund Faulkner ever give you anything for safekeeping? Documents, perhaps?" The old man's eyes widened slightly. "As a matter of fact, he did. About a month before he passed, he came to me after Sunday service, said he wasn't feeling well and wanted to ensure certain papers were protected." He rose from the table. "Wait here." He disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a small leather pouch. "He asked me to give this to Josephine if anything happened to him, with all the confusion after his death and you moving back to the homestead alone." He handed the pouch to Josephine. "I should have brought this to you sooner, I'm sorry." With trembling fingers, Josephine opened the pouch. Inside were several folded papers. The first was a letter addressed to her in her father's familiar handwriting. The second was the deed to their land, the original, with the county seal still visible. Tears filled her eyes as she unfolded the letter. "My dearest Josephine," it began. "If you are reading this, I have left this world sooner than I wished. Know that my greatest joy was watching you grow into the strong, intelligent woman you have become. The land is now yours, as it should be. There are men who will try to take it from you, men who see only profit where we see home. Trust few, fight hard, and never forget that the land endures long after we are gone. All my love, Father." Josephine wiped away tears, carefully refolding the letter. "Thank you, Reverend. This means everything." The old man smiled gently. "Your father was a wise man. He knew trouble was coming." Thomas examined the deed carefully. "This proves Holloway's document is a forgery. We need to get this to Judge Wilson in Denver." "Holloway won't give up easily," Reverend Powell warned. "Even with the original deed, he has power in this county." "Which is why we need the federal judge," Thomas agreed. "But first, we need to get safely away from town. Holloway's men could be anywhere." As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of horses approaching outside. Thomas moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. "3 riders," he said tersely. "Holloway's men by the look of them." Reverend Powell's face paled. "The back door," he whispered, pointing, "through the garden and into the trees beyond." Thomas nodded, taking Josephine's arm. "Keep the papers safe," he told her as they hurried toward the rear of the cabin. They slipped out the back door just as a heavy knock sounded at the front. Moving quietly through the Reverend's small vegetable garden, they reached the edge of the pine forest that bordered the churchyard. "Our horses," Josephine whispered, glancing back toward the front of the church where they'd left their mounts. "We'll have to leave them," Thomas replied grimly. "There's a ranch about 3 miles east belongs to the Harmon family. We can get fresh horses there." They moved deeper into the forest, guided only by moonlight filtering through the pine branches. Behind them, they could hear raised voices, Holloway's men questioning the Reverend. "Will he be safe?" Josephine asked, worry for the old man making her pause. "They won't harm a man of God," Thomas assured her, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Not with witnesses in town. Come on, we need to keep moving." They traveled through the night, keeping to the cover of the forest when possible. Thomas moved with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, guiding them around obstacles and choosing the easiest path through difficult terrain. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the Harmon Ranch, a modest operation with a small house and several outbuildings. A dog began barking as they approached, and a moment later a man emerged from the house with a shotgun. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wary. "Daniel, it's Thomas Tucker from the Double T." The man lowered his shotgun slightly. "Tucker, what in blazes are you doing here at this hour?" Thomas quickly explained their situation. Daniel Harmon, a weather-beaten man in his 40s, listened with increasing concern. "Holloway's gone too far this time," he said when Thomas finished. "Come inside. My wife will fix you something to eat while I saddle fresh horses." Inside the farmhouse, Mrs. Harmon, a kind-faced woman with practical hands, served them a hearty breakfast while their teenage son kept watch outside. "Holloway's been squeezing small ranchers like us for years," Mrs. Harmon said as she poured coffee. "Last summer, he dammed the creek that runs through his property. Nearly dried up our water supply until Daniel and some other ranchers rode out and tore it down. He's getting bolder," her husband added, returning from the barn. "Word is he's bringing in gunmen from Wyoming, professional troublemakers. All the more reason to get this deed to Judge Wilson," Thomas said grimly. Daniel nodded. "I've saddled my 2 best horses for you. They're fast and have good stamina." The train to Denver leaves from Silver Creek Station at noon. It's about 4 hours hard ride from here. "Silver Creek," Thomas frowned. "That's risky. It takes us close to Holloway's main ranch." "It's your best chance of reaching Denver quickly," Daniel insisted. "Any other route would take days." Thomas glanced at Josephine, who looked exhausted but determined. "What do you think? Can you manage a hard ride?" She straightened her shoulders. "I've been riding since I could walk, Mr. Tucker. I'll manage." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, riding southeast towards Silver Creek. The borrowed horses were indeed excellent-spirited but responsive, covering ground quickly without tiring. As they rode, the terrain changed from pine forest to open rangeland, making them more visible but also allowing them to see anyone approaching from a distance. Thomas kept them to low ground when possible, following dry creek beds and staying in the shadow of hills. They had been riding for about 2 hours when Thomas suddenly reined in his horse, gesturing for Josephine to do the same. He pointed silently to a ridge about half a mile to their right, where a line of riders was visible against the sky. "Holloway's men," Josephine whispered. Thomas nodded grimly. "They're between us and Silver Creek. They must have guessed our destination." "What do we do now?" Thomas studied the landscape, considering their options. "There's an old mining trail through those hills," he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping to the east. "It's rough going, but it comes out just north of the station, if we can reach it without being seen." They altered course, keeping to a shallow ravine that provided some cover. For a tense half-hour, they made their way toward the hills, constantly checking the ridgeline for signs they'd been spotted. They had almost reached the base of the hills when a shout went up behind them. Turning in his saddle, Thomas saw 3 riders breaking away from the main group, heading in their direction. "They've seen us," he said tersely. "Ride hard for the trail. I'll hold them off." "No," Josephine protested. "We stay together." There was no time to argue. The riders were closing fast, and the entrance to the mining trail was still a quarter-mile ahead. "Then we both ride," Thomas decided. "Fast as these horses can carry us." They spurred their mounts forward, racing across the open ground toward the narrow canyon that marked the trail entrance. Behind them, their pursuers were gaining, the sound of hoofbeats growing louder. A shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust several yards to their left. Another followed, closer this time. "Almost there," Thomas encouraged as they reached the rocky ground leading to the canyon. They plunged into the narrow passage, just as another volley of shots echoed behind them. The trail climbed steeply, forcing them to slow their pace as the horses picked their way over loose rock and abandoned mining equipment. Looking back, Thomas saw their pursuers enter the canyon. "The trail narrows ahead," he said. "It will slow them down." The old mining trail wound through the hills, sometimes barely wide enough for a single horse. In places, rusty rails and rotting timbers from abandoned operations created obstacles they had to navigate carefully. Their pursuers fell gradually behind, the difficult terrain negating their superior numbers. By the time Thomas and Josephine emerged on the north side of the hills, they had opened up a considerable lead. Below them, they could see the Silver Creek Station, a small building beside the gleaming rails that stretched east toward Denver. A plume of smoke in the distance indicated the approaching train. "We're going to make it," Josephine said, hope rising in her voice for the first time that day. Thomas wasn't so confident. Holloway could have men at the station too. We need to be careful. They approached cautiously, keeping to cover until they could survey the small platform. Two passengers waited with luggage: a well-dressed woman with a young boy and an elderly gentleman reading a newspaper. A station agent lounged in the doorway of the building. No sign of Holloway's men. Looks clear, Thomas said, but we need to move quickly. The train won't stop for long. They rode down to a stand of trees near the station, where they dismounted and secured their horses. The animals will find their way back to the Harmon place, Thomas assured her, removing his saddlebags. Horses are smarter than most men give them credit for. They walked casually onto the platform just as the train came into view around a distant bend. The station agent glanced at them with mild curiosity, but asked no questions when Thomas purchased 2 tickets to Denver. The train was slowing, brakes squealing, when Thomas suddenly stiffened. 2 riders were approaching from the west, men he recognized from Holloway's ranch. "Get ready to board quickly," he murmured to Josephine. "Our friends have arrived." The train shuddered to a stop beside the platform. The conductor stepped down, calling Silver Creek Station. 20-minute stop for water. Thomas took Josephine's elbow, guiding her toward the nearest passenger car as the other travelers began to board. Behind them, the 2 riders dismounted and strode onto the platform. "Tucker," one of them called. "Hold up there." Thomas urged Josephine up the steps into the car. "Find a seat near the back," he whispered. "I'll be right behind you." She clutched the leather pouch containing the deed to her chest, hesitating. "Thomas, go," he insisted. "Keep those papers safe." As Josephine disappeared into the car, Thomas turned to face the approaching men. He recognized them now: Bill Kirby and Frank Sawyer, longtime hands at Holloway's ranch and known troublemakers. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Thomas said calmly, though his hand drifted closer to his pistol. "Something I can help you with," Kirby, a burly man with a scarred face, sneered. "Where's the Faulkner woman, Tucker? Holloway wants a word with her." "I imagine he does," Thomas replied, "but she's not available for a conversation at present." Sawyer, thinner but no less dangerous, moved to flank him. "Don't play games, boy. Hand her over and maybe you walk away from this." The conductor called, "All aboard." The other passengers had already boarded, and the station agent had retreated inside the building, sensing trouble. "Seems my train is leaving," Thomas said, backing toward the steps. "You boys have a pleasant afternoon now." Kirby's hand dropped to his gun. "You're not getting on that train, Tucker." Thomas saw the movement and drew his own weapon in one fluid motion, years of practice evident in the speed of his draw. "I'd reconsider that if I were you." A tense standoff ensued, the only sound the hissing of the train's steam engine. Thomas stood on the first step of the car, his gun steady. Kirby and Sawyer faced him, hands hovering near their weapons. "2 against 1, Tucker," Sawyer said. "Bad odds." "Maybe," Thomas agreed, "but I guarantee I'll take at least one of you with me. Which one wants to volunteer?" Neither man moved. Behind them, a whistle sounded as the engineer signaled the imminent departure. "Last chance, boys," Thomas said. "Walk away. Tell Holloway he's lost this round." For a moment, it seemed they might rush him anyway, then Kirby grudgingly raised his hands slightly. "This ain't over, Tucker." "Not by a long shot." "Never thought it was," Thomas replied as the train began to move. He kept his gun trained on them as he stepped fully into the car, closing the door behind him. Only when the station had disappeared around a bend did Thomas holster his weapon and make his way through the car to where Josephine waited, her face pale with worry. "You're all right," she breathed as he slid into the seat beside her. "Takes more than Holloway's thugs to worry me," he said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He glanced out the window at the passing landscape. "We should reach Denver by nightfall. Judge Wilson's office opens early. We can see him first thing in the morning." Josephine nodded, her fingers still clutching the pouch containing her father's deed. "Do you think it will be enough? The deed, I mean." "It has to be," Thomas replied. "The law is clear on property rights, even out here. With the original deed and your father's letter, Judge Wilson will have to rule in your favor." "And if he doesn't?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Then we find another way. I'm not letting Holloway take your land, Josephine, I promise you that." Something in his voice, a fierce determination that matched her own, made Josephine's heart skip. In the few days she'd known him, Thomas Tucker had risked everything to help her, a woman who had been a stranger to him. She found herself studying his profile as he gazed out the window, the strong line of his jaw, the determined set of his mouth, the way his eyes missed nothing of the passing terrain. "Why did you really help me, Thomas?" she asked softly. "The truth." He turned to her, his expression serious. "At first, it was because I couldn't stand by and watch Holloway destroy another family. I knew what he was capable of." He paused. "But now it's because I believe in what you're fighting for, your connection to that land, your determination to honor your father's legacy." His voice softened. "And because you're the kind of woman worth fighting for, Josephine Faulkner." The train rattled on toward Denver, carrying them toward what they hoped would be justice, but what both suspected would only be another chapter in their battle against Victor Holloway. Denver in 1876 was a city in transition, part frontier town, part emerging metropolis. As Thomas and Josephine stepped off the train the following morning, they were met with the bustle of a place experiencing the growing pains of rapid expansion. Stone buildings stood alongside wooden structures, muddy streets were giving way to proper roads, and people from all walks of life mingled on the busy sidewalks. "The federal courthouse is this way," Thomas said, offering Josephine his arm as they navigated the crowded station platform. They had spent the night in a modest hotel near the station, Thomas insisting on separate rooms despite the expense. Josephine had slept fitfully, the precious deed secure beneath her pillow. Now, dressed in their borrowed clothes and trying to appear more confident than they felt, they made their way through the city streets toward the imposing stone building that housed the federal courts. Inside, they were directed to Judge Wilson's chambers on the second floor. A clerk informed them that the judge was hearing cases that morning but would have a brief recess at 10 o'clock. "He might be able to see you then," the young man said, "if your business is urgent." "It is," Thomas assured him. "Tell him it concerns land fraud in San Luis Valley, specifically involving Victor Holloway." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly at the name. "I'll inform the judge," he promised. They waited on a hard wooden bench in the corridor, watching lawyers and officials hurry past. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doors to the courtroom opened and several men emerged, talking in low voices. The clerk approached them. "Judge Wilson will see you now, but he can only spare 10 minutes. They were ushered into a well-appointed office where Judge Wilson, a tall, thin man with shrewd eyes and silver hair, sat behind a massive desk. "I understand this concerns Victor Holloway," he said without preamble. "I'm familiar with the name. He's been before my court 3 times in land disputes." "And each time he's won," Thomas said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. The judge's expression remained neutral. "Each case is decided on its merits, young man. Now, what brings you to my chambers?" Josephine stepped forward, placing the leather pouch on the desk. "My name is Josephine Faulkner. My father, Edmund Faulkner, owned a homestead in San Luis Valley. After his death last winter, Victor Holloway attempted to seize our land using forged documents." Judge Wilson's eyes sharpened with interest. "Forged documents. That's a serious accusation, Miss Faulkner." "I have proof," she said, opening the pouch and carefully extracting the original deed and her father's letter. The judge examined the papers carefully, his expression giving nothing away. After several minutes, he looked up. "This appears to be in order. The county seal is authentic, and the date of registration precedes the document Holloway has been presenting." "Then you'll invalidate his claim?" Thomas asked eagerly. Judge Wilson steepled his fingers. "It's not quite that simple. I would need to examine both documents side by side, hear testimony from the county clerk who registered the deed, perhaps even call in an expert on handwriting." He paused. "However, I can issue a temporary injunction preventing Holloway from taking any action regarding the property until a full hearing can be scheduled." Josephine's heart sank. How long would that take? A month, perhaps 2. The judge must have seen their dismay, for he added, "The wheels of justice turn slowly, Miss Faulkner, but they do turn. If your claim is legitimate, and these documents suggest it is the law will ultimately protect your rights. With respect, Your Honor, Thomas said, Holloway doesn't always wait for the law. He has a habit of taking matters into his own hands. Judge Wilson frowned. Are you suggesting he would defy a federal injunction? I'm suggesting he might find ways around it, Thomas replied carefully. Ways that might not leave evidence but would achieve the same result. The judge studied him thoughtfully. You speak from experience. Thomas hesitated, then said, My father was James Tucker. His barn burned 3 years ago with him inside. The official finding was accident, but it happened 2 days after he refused to sell his water rights to Holloway. Recognition flickered in the judge's eyes. I remember that case. There wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges. He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. I'll issue the injunction today and send a telegraph to Sheriff Patterson informing him that any attempt by Holloway to occupy or modify the Faulkner property will be considered contempt of court. Thank you, Your Honor, Josephine said sincerely. Don't thank me yet, Miss Faulkner. An injunction is just paper. It won't stop bullets or fire. He picked up a pen. I suggest you find somewhere safe to wait until the hearing. Holloway has friends in high places, including the territorial governor. We have friends too, Thomas said firmly, and we're not abandoning the land. Judge Wilson gave him a measuring look. Then I wish you luck, Mr. Tucker. You'll need it. He began writing on an official form. I'll have this injunction ready within the hour. My clerk will provide you with copies. As they left the courthouse, injunction in hand, Thomas could see the mix of relief and apprehension on Josephine's face. It's a start, he said encouragingly. With the judge's injunction, Holloway can't legally touch your land. But as the judge said, it's just paper, Josephine replied. Holloway won't give up so easily. No, he won't, Thomas agreed, which is why we need allies. He led her toward the telegraph office. We need to let Jenkins know what's happening, and I have an idea that might give us an advantage. At the telegraph office, Thomas sent 2 messages. The first was to Jenkins, explaining the outcome of their meeting with Judge Wilson and their plans to return. The second was to a name Josephine didn't recognize. Who's Matthew Stanton? She asked as they left the office. A reporter for the Rocky Mountain News, Thomas replied. Before I started working at the Double T, I did some freighting between here and Pueblo. Got to know him a bit. He's written articles about land grabs and corruption in the territory. You think he could help us? Thomas nodded. Holloway hates publicity. He prefers to operate in the shadows, where he can pressure and threaten without witnesses. If Stanton starts asking questions, publishing stories about forged deeds and intimidation tactics, it could force Holloway to back off. Josephine finished, understanding dawning. At least until the hearing, Thomas agreed. I suggested Stanton meet us for lunch before our train leaves. He's always hungry for a good story, and this one has everything: a greedy land baron, a young woman fighting for her inheritance, forged documents, gunmen, and a brave cowboy coming to her rescue, Josephine added with a small smile. Thomas felt a flush creep up his neck. I'm just doing what anyone with a conscience would do. No, Josephine said softly, placing her hand on his arm. You're doing far more than that, Thomas Tucker. And I don't know if I can ever repay you. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first desperate flight from Holloway's men. The moment was broken by a cheerful voice calling Thomas's name. They turned to see a lanky man in his 30s approaching, a notebook visible in his coat pocket. Tucker, good to see you, the man said, pumping Thomas's hand enthusiastically. And this must be Miss Faulkner, Matthew Stanton, Rocky Mountain News. He tipped his hat to Josephine. Your telegram mentioned Victor Holloway and land fraud. You certainly know how to get a reporter's attention. They found a small cafe where they could talk privately, and over a simple meal. Thomas and Josephine related the entire story from her father's death to Holloway's attempts to seize the land, the forged documents, the confrontation at the Double T, and their journey to Denver. Stanton took rapid notes, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. This is exactly the kind of story that sells papers, he said. And more importantly, it's the kind that can make a difference. Holloway's been operating with impunity for too long. Will you write about it? Josephine asked. My dear Miss Faulkner, I'll do more than that. I'll make it a series Land Baron's Reign of Terror or something equally provocative. First installment will be in tomorrow's edition. He closed his notebook with a snap. And I'll be attending that hearing when it happens. The public deserves to know the truth. As they boarded the train back to Silver Creek that afternoon, Josephine felt a cautious optimism. The injunction was secured in her reticule, and Stanton had promised his first article would appear the following day. Do you think it will work? She asked Thomas as the train pulled away from the station. The injunction and the newspaper articles, they're tools, Thomas replied thoughtfully. They won't solve the problem on their own, but they give us leverage, time to gather more support. He gazed out the window at the passing landscape. The real battle will be back home, convincing other ranchers to stand with us against Holloway. Do you think they will? Some will. Jenkins already has. The Harmons, others who have been hurt by Holloway over the years. He turned to her. Fear has kept people isolated, fighting their own battles alone, but together. Together we might actually win, Josephine finished. The journey back to Silver Creek was uneventful, but tension mounted as they approached the small station. This time, Thomas had purchased tickets only to Silver Creek, intending to hire horses there for the ride to the Double T. Stay alert, he murmured as the train began to slow. Holloway might have men watching the station. But the platform was nearly deserted when they disembarked, only the station agent and an elderly couple waiting for the westbound train. No sign of Holloway's men. Seems too quiet, Thomas said, his hand resting near his holstered pistol as they crossed to the small livery stable adjacent to the station. The liveryman, a grizzled old-timer named Pete, greeted Thomas with a nod of recognition. Heard you might be coming back this way. Got a message for you. Thomas tensed. From who? Jenkins. Said to tell you that Holloway's gathered a bunch of his men at his main ranch, something big brewing. Pete lowered his voice. Also said he's sent word to friendly ranchers. They're gathering at the Double T. Thomas and Josephine exchanged glances. We need horses, Thomas said. Good ones. We need to get to Jenkins's place as quickly as possible. Pete nodded. Got just the pair, strong and fast. He hesitated. Be careful out there, Tucker. Holloway's bringing in some hard cases from Wyoming. Professional gun hands. Thanks for the warning, Thomas said grimly. We'll watch our backs. They set out from Silver Creek as the sun began its westward descent, riding hard toward the Double T. Thomas chose a route that kept them away from main trails and offered good visibility of the surrounding terrain. They had covered about half the distance when Thomas reined in sharply, gesturing for Josephine to do the same. Ahead, a plume of dust marked the passage of multiple riders moving perpendicular to their path. Holloway's men, Josephine whispered. Thomas nodded, counting silently. At least 10 riders, heading toward your property, I'd guess. But the injunction, like the judge said, it's just paper. Thomas studied the terrain, considering their options. We need to reach the Double T before they realize we're back. From there, we can gather Jenkins's men and any other ranchers who have arrived. They altered course slightly, giving the dust cloud a wide berth. As they rode, Thomas explained his thinking. Holloway's likely planning to occupy your land before the hearing. Once he's there with armed men, it would take a federal marshal to remove him, and there aren't many of those in the territory. So what can we do? Josephine asked, fear and determination warring in her voice. We gather our allies, present a united front. Make it clear that taking your land means war with every independent rancher in the valley. Thomas's expression was grim. Holloway may be willing to bully individuals, but even he would hesitate to start a range war. Too much attention, too much risk to his reputation in Denver. They reached the Double T as dusk was falling. The ranch yard was busier than usual, with extra horses in the corral and several wagons parked near the barn. As they rode in, Jenkins emerged from the main house, relief evident on his weathered face. About time you two showed up, he called. Was beginning to worry Holloway had intercepted you. Thomas dismounted, helping Josephine down from her horse. We saw a group of riders heading toward the Faulkner place. Holloway's men, Jenkins nodded grimly. He's making his move. Brought in at least 20 hired guns from Wyoming and Montana. They're setting up at your homestead, Miss Faulkner, building barricades, posting guards. But we have the injunction, Josephine protested, producing the document from her reticule. I telegraphed Sheriff Patterson about that, Jenkins said. He claims he hasn't received any official notification from Judge Wilson. His disgust was evident. Patterson's firmly in Holloway's pocket. So the law won't help us, Thomas concluded. Who do we have on our side? Jenkins led them toward the house. The Harmons are here, the Prestons from the East Valley, Old Man Rodriguez and his sons, a few others, about 15 men altogether plus my hands. He paused. Not enough to take on Holloway's army in a straight fight, but enough to make a statement. Inside, the main room of Jenkins's house had been transformed into a makeshift headquarters. A large map of the valley was spread on the table, and several ranchers stood around it, engaged in intense discussion. They looked up as Jenkins entered with Thomas and Josephine. So this is the young lady Holloway's so determined to run off, said one, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard. Daniel Harmon told us what happened. Mighty brave of you to stand your ground, Miss Faulkner. Thank you, Mr. Preston, Ezra Preston. My family's been ranching in this valley for 20 years. Seen Holloway push out too many good folks already. Another man stepped forward, tall and lean, with the weathered features of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. Miguel Rodriguez. My father homesteaded our land before the war. Holloway has tried 3 times to divert our water. 3 times we have stopped him. His dark eyes held a fierce pride. We stand with you, señorita. One by one, the ranchers introduced themselves to Josephine, each with their own story of Holloway's intimidation or underhanded tactics, each expressing determination that this time would be different. What's our plan? Thomas asked when the introductions were complete. Jenkins indicated the map. Holloway's men are here at the Faulkner homestead. They've set up barricades around the house and barn, posted sentries. According to our scout, they're settling in for a long stay. They're trespassing, Preston growled. Federal injunction says so. Which means we have the law on our side, Jenkins agreed. I propose we ride out at first light, all of us together, present the injunction, make it clear that we're united in this. And if they refuse to leave, Rodriguez asked. A tense silence fell over the room. Then we have a decision to make, Jenkins said quietly. Whether to enforce the law ourselves or wait for federal authorities. He looked at Josephine. It's your land, Miss Faulkner. What do you want us to do? All eyes turned to her. Josephine felt the weight of their expectations, their readiness to risk themselves for her cause. She thought of her father, of the land he had loved, of the home they had built together. I want my land back, she said firmly. But I don't want blood shed for it, not yours, not mine, not even Holloway's men. They're just hired guns doing a job. She looked at Thomas, drawing strength from his steady gaze. We present the injunction as planned, make our show of force. But we also bring Mr. Stanton from the Rocky Mountain News. The reporter. Jenkins looked surprised. Josephine nodded. Holloway fears exposure more than he fears guns. If his actions are publicized, if everyone in the territory learns how he operates, his influence in Denver will suffer. Thomas smiled slowly. Josephine's right. Holloway's power comes from his connections, his reputation as a successful businessman. That reputation won't survive stories of forged deeds and armed occupations. So we bring the reporter, Preston said thoughtfully. Make sure there's a witness to whatever happens. And we bring the injunction, Rodriguez added. Show Holloway's men that they're on the wrong side of the law. And we bring guns, Jenkins said pragmatically, just in case Holloway doesn't care about reporters or injunctions. They spent the next hour planning the details of their confrontation. A messenger was dispatched to Silver Creek with a telegram for Matthew Stanton, inviting him to witness the standoff. Weapons were checked, horses prepared, provisions packed. Throughout the discussion, Thomas stayed close to Josephine, his quiet support a foundation she could lean on. When the meeting finally broke up, with plans to depart at dawn, he walked with her onto the porch of Jenkins's house. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. In the distance, the mountains were dark silhouettes against the horizon. Are you afraid? Thomas asked softly. Josephine considered the question. Yes, she admitted, but not enough to turn back. Your father would be proud, he said, standing up for what's yours but looking for a peaceful solution first. I keep thinking about what he wrote in his letter, she said, about the land enduring long after we're gone. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want to be able to live with it for all the years to come. Thomas nodded, understanding. That's wisdom, Josephine, the kind that comes from loving something more than yourself. She turned to face him, finding his eyes in the dim light spilling from the house windows. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Thomas. You would have found a way, he said with a small smile. You're stronger than you know. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but I'm glad I didn't have to face it alone. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind since Denver. What happens after? When this is over one way or another, what will you do? Thomas looked out across the darkened valley. I've been drifting since my father died, taking jobs, moving on, never settling. He paused. But lately, I've been thinking about putting down roots again. Where? Josephine asked, her heart beating a little faster. He turned to her, his gaze direct and clear. Wherever there's a reason to stay. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, possibilities, hopes, fears. Before either could speak further, the door opened behind them and Jenkins stepped onto the porch. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but we've had word from town. Stanton will meet us at Silver Creek at dawn. And... He hesitated. There's a rumor that Holloway himself is riding in from Denver tonight. Seems he wants to oversee this personally. Thomas's expression hardened. That changes things. Holloway wouldn't come unless he was confident of success. Or unless he's worried, Josephine suggested. The injunction, the newspaper articles, maybe he's feeling pressure. Either way, Jenkins said, tomorrow just got more complicated. You both should get some rest while you can. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson. The assembled ranchers and cowboys, 27 in all, mounted their horses in the double T yard, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air. Josephine, dressed in her own clothes that Mrs. Winters had washed and mended, sat astride a steady bay mare. The leather pouch containing the injunction and her father's deed was secured inside her jacket, close to her heart. Thomas rode beside her, his face calm but his eyes alert. He had checked and rechecked his pistol and rifle, hoping he wouldn't need either but unwilling to face Holloway unprepared. Remember the plan, Jenkins called as they prepared to ride out. We approach openly, no threatening moves unless threatened first. We're there to uphold the law, not break it. They rode first to Silver Creek, where Matthew Stanton waited at the station, his own horse saddled and ready. The reporter's eyes widened at the sight of so many armed men. Quite the posse you've assembled, Tucker, he remarked as they approached. Not a posse, Thomas corrected. Just concerned citizens supporting a neighbor whose property is being illegally occupied. Stanton grinned, patting the notebook in his pocket. That's an even better headline. From Silver Creek, they rode toward the Faulkner homestead, their numbers drawing curious stares from the few people they passed along the way. Word had spread quickly about the confrontation brewing, and most locals were wisely staying clear of the area. As they neared Josephine's property, Thomas called a halt on a rise overlooking the homestead. From this vantage point, they could see that Holloway had been busy. Barricades had been erected around the small cabin and barn. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter. In the yard, more men clustered around a campfire. A large tent had been set up near the barn, likely Holloway's personal quarters. I count at least 25 men, Jenkins said quietly after studying the scene through a spyglass. More than we estimated. And they've had time to dig in, Preston observed grimly. Thomas turned to Josephine. It's not too late to reconsider. We could wait for federal marshals. She shook her head, her jaw set. That could take weeks. And every day there is another day they could damage the land, the house, everything my father built. She looked at the assembled ranchers. If any of you want to turn back, I understand. This isn't your fight. It became our fight when Holloway decided he could take what isn't his, Rodriguez said firmly. The other ranchers nodded in agreement. Then we proceed as planned, Jenkins decided. Open approach, no weapons drawn unless they fire first. They rode down the slope toward the homestead, their group spread wide enough to be impressive but not threatening. Thomas and Josephine rode at the center, with Jenkins and the older ranchers flanking them. Stanton stayed slightly behind, his notebook already in hand. Their approach was quickly noticed. Men scrambled to positions behind the barricades, rifles raised, shouts carried across the open ground. When they were about 100 yards from the barricades, a voice called out, "That's far enough. This is private property." Jenkins urged his horse forward a few paces. "This is Faulkner land," he called back, "and the only one with any right to it is riding right here beside me." There was a moment of confusion behind the barricades, then a flurry of activity. The front gate opened, and a man rode out to meet them, Victor Holloway himself, flanked by 2 armed riders. Holloway was exactly as Thomas remembered, heavyset, expensively dressed, with a florid face and cold eyes. He reined in about 20 yards from their group, assessing them with a calculating gaze. "Jenkins," he acknowledged coldly, "I see you've brought friends to our little property dispute." "No dispute about it, Holloway," Jenkins replied. "Miss Faulkner has the original deed to this land, registered and legal, and she has a federal injunction ordering your men off her property." Holloway's gaze shifted to Josephine, his expression a mixture of contempt and amusement. "The judge issued his ruling without hearing both sides, Miss Faulkner, a temporary measure only. When I present my evidence at the hearing, you'll find the law takes a different view." "Evidence you forged," Thomas said, unable to contain his anger. Holloway's eyes narrowed as he recognized Thomas. "The Tucker boy, still carrying that chip on your shoulder, I see." His smile was thin. "You should be careful about making accusations of forgery. Libel is a serious matter." "So is perjury," Stanton spoke up, nudging his horse forward. "Matthew Stanton, Rocky Mountain News. I'd be interested in seeing this evidence of yours, Mr. Holloway. My readers appreciate thoroughness in reporting." Holloway's composure slipped momentarily. "The press has no business interfering in private legal matters." "Land fraud isn't private," Stanton replied cheerfully, scribbling in his notebook. "Especially when it involves one of the territory's most prominent businessmen." Josephine urged her horse forward, drawing level with Jenkins. "I have a federal injunction, Mr. Holloway," she said clearly, removing the document from inside her jacket. "Signed by Judge Wilson. It prohibits you or your men from occupying my property pending the hearing." "A piece of paper doesn't impress me, Miss Faulkner," Holloway replied. "I have 25 armed men who say this land is mine until the courts decide otherwise. And I have 27 neighbors who say differently," Josephine countered, "plus a reporter who's documenting everything you say and do." She held the injunction higher. "Are you refusing to comply with a federal court order, Mr. Holloway? That's something even your friends in the territorial government might find difficult to ignore." For a long moment, Holloway said nothing, his gaze moving from Josephine to the assembled ranchers to Stanton with his ever-present notebook. Thomas could almost see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes, weighing options, considering consequences. "You've made your point, Miss Faulkner," Holloway said finally, "but this changes nothing. The hearing will determine who owns this land. And until then, you and your men will vacate my property," Josephine insisted. "Today, now," Holloway's face darkened. "Don't push your luck, girl. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Thomas moved his horse forward, positioning himself protectively beside Josephine. "She knows exactly who she's dealing with, Holloway. We all do. A man who forges documents, who intimidates his neighbors, who burns barns when he doesn't get his way." His voice carried clearly across the open ground, loud enough for all to hear, including Stanton, whose pencil was flying across his notebook. "Be careful, Tucker," Holloway warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "Accusations like that could get a man killed." "Is that a threat, Mr. Holloway?" Stanton called out. "Could you clarify that statement for my readers?" Holloway ignored the reporter, his attention fixed on Thomas and Josephine. The tension in the air was palpable, armed men on both sides, fingers near triggers, a single wrong move away from violence. It was Jenkins who broke the deadlock. "We're not here for a gunfight, Holloway. We're here to uphold the law. The injunction gives you 24 hours to vacate. We'll be back tomorrow to ensure you've complied. And if we haven't, one of Holloway's men challenged, then we'll have no choice but to telegraph Judge Wilson, Jenkins replied calmly. I imagine he'll be interested to hear that his orders are being defied. Might even send federal marshals to enforce them. He paused. And of course, Mr. Stanton here will ensure the whole territory knows exactly what happened. Holloway's face was a mask of controlled fury. For a moment, Thomas thought he might order his men to open fire despite the consequences. Then, with visible effort, the cattle baron reined in his temper. 24 hours, he said coldly. Use them wisely, Miss Faulkner. Consider what you really want: a protracted legal battle that will drain whatever meager resources you have, or a generous cash settlement that would allow you to start fresh elsewhere. I want my home, Josephine replied simply. Nothing more, nothing less. Holloway's smile was thin. We'll see. He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the barricades, his men following. Only when they were well away from the homestead did the tension begin to ease. The ranchers talked quietly among themselves as they rode, relief mingling with continued caution. Will he leave? Josephine asked Thomas as they made their way back toward the double T. Thomas considered the question. He might. The injunction, the publicity, the show of solidarity, it's more resistance than he's used to facing. But you don't think so, she observed, reading his expression. Holloway doesn't like to lose, Thomas admitted, and he especially doesn't like to be challenged publicly. He glanced back toward the homestead, just visible in the distance. No, I think he's planning something. We need to be ready. Their concerns proved prescient. Late that afternoon, a rider from town brought news that Holloway had telegraphed the territorial governor, claiming that armed vigilantes were threatening legitimate business interests in San Luis Valley. He's trying to get the governor to send militia, Jenkins said grimly after reading the message. Twist the situation to make us look like the lawbreakers. Will it work? Josephine asked. Jenkins exchanged glances with the other ranchers. Hard to say. The governor is friendly to business interests, but he's also up for re-election soon. Sending militia to help a rich man push a woman off her land, that might not play well with voters. What about our deadline? Thomas asked. Will Holloway comply with the injunction? I wouldn't count on it, Preston said. He's stalling, hoping for reinforcements from Denver. Stanton, who had returned to the double T with them, looked up from his notes. My article about this morning's confrontation will be in tomorrow's paper. And I've telegraphed Judge Wilson directly, informing him of Holloway's response to the injunction. So we wait, Rodriguez concluded, see what tomorrow brings. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, Thomas found Josephine sitting alone on the porch of Jenkins's house, gazing toward the distant mountains. You should try to rest, he said gently, sitting beside her. Tomorrow may be a long day. I keep thinking about my father, she replied, her voice soft in the gathering darkness, about what he would do if he were here. What would he do? A small smile touched her lips. Stand his ground, trust in what's right. But also be smart about it, pick his battles carefully, know when to hold firm and when to bend. Sounds like a wise man, Thomas observed. I see where you get it from. They sat in companionable silence for a while. The night sounds of the ranch, a soothing backdrop, horses moving in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the windmill turning in the light breeze. Thomas, Josephine said eventually, what you said last night about putting down roots, did you mean it? He turned to look at her, her face softly illuminated by the light from the house windows. Every word. And if all this ends well, if we manage to keep my land, would you consider? She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Consider what, Josephine? Staying, she said simply. Helping me rebuild what my father started. It's good land enough for cattle, crops, a future. The weight of her invitation hung in the air between them, not just an offer of employment or partnership, but something more, something neither had yet found the courage to name. I can't think of anything I'd want more, Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Your father built something worth fighting for. I'd be honored to help you carry it forward. Josephine's fingers tightened around his. It would be a hard life, no guarantees, Thomas smiled. The best things rarely come with guarantees. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, with gentle deliberation, Thomas leaned forward and kissed her a tender, questioning gesture that Josephine answered by raising her free hand to his cheek, holding him close as she returned the kiss. When they finally parted, both were smiling despite the uncertainty that tomorrow would bring. "Whatever happens," Thomas promised, "you won't face it alone." Dawn broke gray and threatening, clouds hanging low over the mountains. A fitful wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of approaching rain. It was a fitting backdrop for the tense scene unfolding at the Faulkner homestead. True to his word, Holloway had not vacated the property. Instead, his men had strengthened their position overnight, digging rifle pits and reinforcing barricades. The message was clear: they would not leave willingly. This time when Thomas, Josephine, and the ranchers approached, there was no parley. Armed men simply watched from behind their fortifications, rifles at the ready. "He's forcing our hand," Jenkins observed grimly as they surveyed the scene from the same rise they had used the previous day. "Hoping we'll either attack and justify his claims of vigilantism, or back down and look weak." "So what do we do?" Preston asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. From the direction of Silver Creek came a group of mounted men, at least 15, moving at a steady pace. "Reinforcements for Holloway," Rodriguez wondered, reaching for his rifle. "No," Thomas said, using Jenkins's spyglass to get a better look. "It's Sheriff Patterson, but he's not alone. There's someone else with him, someone in a uniform." As the riders drew closer, they could make out the details. Sheriff Patterson led the group, but beside him rode a tall man in the uniform of a federal marshal. Behind them came a dozen deputies and several civilians, including Matthew Stanton, who waved when he spotted them. "What in blazes?" Jenkins muttered as the newcomers approached. Sheriff Patterson looked distinctly uncomfortable as he reined in before them. "Morning, folks," he said without his usual bluster. "This here is Marshal Collins from Denver. He's got orders regarding the Faulkner property." The marshal, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, surveyed the assembled ranchers. "I understand there's a federal injunction being ignored," he said. "Judge Wilson takes a dim view of that. Mr. Holloway claims the injunction was issued without hearing his evidence," Sheriff Patterson began, but fell silent when the marshal gave him a hard look. "The law is clear, Sheriff. The injunction stands until the hearing." Marshal Collins turned to Josephine. "Miss Faulkner, I believe this concerns your property." Josephine urged her horse forward. "Yes, sir. Mr. Holloway's men have occupied my homestead despite the injunction. They refuse to leave." The marshal nodded. "So I've been informed." He glanced at the armed ranchers. "Though I see you found support among your neighbors." "We stand together against bullies," Jenkins said simply. A ghost of a smile touched the marshal's weathered face. "Commendable, but law enforcement is my responsibility now." He turned to Patterson. "Sheriff, you and your deputies will accompany me to serve notice to Holloway and his men. They have 1 hour to vacate the premises as per Judge Wilson's order. If they refuse, they will be arrested for contempt of court." Patterson looked distinctly unhappy but nodded. "Yes, sir." "The rest of you," the marshal continued, addressing the ranchers, "will remain here. This is now a federal matter. Is that clear?" There were murmurs of agreement, though Thomas noted that none of the ranchers made any move to leave or disarm. Stanton urged his horse forward, notebook in hand. "Marshal Collins, Matthew Stanton from the Rocky Mountain News. Could you comment on why a federal marshal was dispatched to this remote location so quickly?" Collins gave the reporter a measured look. "Judge Wilson takes interference with his court very seriously. When he received your telegraph describing Holloway's defiance of his injunction, he contacted my office immediately." The marshal's gaze shifted to Thomas and Josephine, and it seems he had particular interest in this case due to similar incidents in the past that were never properly investigated. Thomas felt a surge of emotion, vindication, relief, a sense that perhaps justice was not as blind as he had feared. Beside him, Josephine reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. They watched as Marshal Collins, Sheriff Patterson, and the deputies rode down to the barricaded homestead. There was a brief, tense conversation at the gate. Then, surprisingly, they were admitted inside. "What do you think is happening?" Josephine asked anxiously. "Collins is laying down the law," Jenkins speculated. "And Holloway is discovering that even his influence has limits." For nearly an hour, they waited on the ridge, watching the homestead for signs of what was transpiring. Then finally, movement men emerging from behind the barricades, loading equipment onto wagons, saddling horses. "They're leaving," Preston said, disbelief and satisfaction mingling in his voice. Sure enough, a procession began forming wagons and mounted men preparing to depart. At their head rode Holloway himself, his face thunderous even at a distance. Marshal Collins and Sheriff Patterson escorted them away from the homestead, heading in the direction of Silver Creek. As they passed the ridge where Thomas and the others waited, Holloway looked up, his gaze locking with Thomas's for a brief, hate-filled moment. "This isn't over, Tucker," he called. "The hearing is still to come." "We'll be there," Thomas replied calmly, "with the truth." Only when Holloway and his men had disappeared from sight did Marshal Collins ride up to join them on the ridge. "The property is clear, Miss Faulkner," he announced. "My deputies have checked every building and found no remaining trespassers." Josephine's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Thank you, Marshal," Collins nodded, his stern expression softening slightly. "I'll be staying in the area until the hearing to ensure there are no further misunderstandings. Judge Wilson has moved the date up 1 week from today in Denver." "We'll be ready," Thomas assured him. As the marshal rode back to join his deputies, Stanton approached, grinning broadly. "Quite a story this is turning into," he remarked. "The territorial governor's office is in an uproar. Seems Holloway's telegram backfired when Judge Wilson contacted the governor directly about the injunction." "What will happen at the hearing?" Josephine asked. Stanton's expression grew more serious. "Holloway still has influence and money for expensive lawyers, but with the original deed, your father's letter, and now this defiance of a court order, I'd say he's fighting an uphill battle." The ranchers began to disperse, returning to their own properties now that the immediate crisis had passed. Jenkins clasped Thomas's shoulder before he left. "Stay at my place until the hearing," he offered. "Both of you safer that way." Thomas nodded gratefully. "We will," and Jenkins. "Thank you for everything," the older man smiled. "That's what neighbors do, son." Finally, only Thomas and Josephine remained on the ridge, looking down at her homestead free of intruders but bearing the scars of Holloway's occupation. Barricades would need to be dismantled, damage repaired, order restored. "Shall we go home?" Thomas asked softly. Josephine turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something more determination, hope, perhaps even love. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." They rode down the slope together, toward the small cabin that had been the center of so much conflict. As they neared, Josephine reined in, taking in the state of her property trampled garden beds, makeshift fortifications around the yard, ruts in the earth from wagon wheels. "They made quite a mess," she observed, but her voice held more resolve than despair. "Nothing that can't be fixed," Thomas assured her. "The important thing is they're gone and the land is still yours." They dismounted in the yard, tying their horses to the hitching post that had somehow survived Holloway's occupation. Josephine approached the cabin cautiously, as if afraid of what she might find inside. The interior was much as she had left it when fleeing days ago, though signs of intrusion were evident. Chair positions changed, cupboard doors left open, a layer of dust on the simple furniture. But the essence of the place, the home her father had built and where she had grown up, remained intact. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching as Josephine moved through the small space, touching familiar objects, re-establishing her connection to the place. When she turned to face him, her expression was one of quiet determination. "It will take work to set everything right again," she said. "I'm good with my hands," Thomas replied with a small smile, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Josephine crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest, looking up into his eyes. "The hearing is still to come. Holloway won't give up easily." "No," Thomas agreed, his arms encircling her waist. "But neither will we." "We," she repeated, the word carrying a weight of meaning that made his heart quicken. "I like the sound of that." His smile deepened. "So do I." Their kiss was different this time, not the tentative exploration of the previous night, but a promise, a commitment to face whatever came next together. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "We should head back to Jenkins's place," he said reluctantly. "It's safer until the hearing." Josephine nodded, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "But we'll come back, every day, start rebuilding." "Every day," Thomas agreed, "until it's safe for you to stay permanently." "For us," she corrected gently, "until it's safe for us." The week before the hearing passed in a flurry of activity. Each day, Thomas and Josephine rode from the Double T to her homestead, working from dawn until dusk to repair the damage Holloway's men had caused. Jenkins and the other ranchers sent hands to help, transforming what could have been weeks of labor into days. The garden was replanted, fences mended, barricades dismantled and repurposed into repairs for the barn. Throughout, Marshal Collins kept his word, posting deputies in the area to ensure no further interference from Holloway. Stanton's articles in the Rocky Mountain News caused a sensation throughout the territory. His vivid descriptions of Holloway's tactics, the forged documents, and the ranchers' stand against intimidation captured public attention. Letters of support arrived daily for Josephine, many from people who had their own stories of Holloway's ruthless business practices. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright. Thomas and Josephine had traveled to Denver the previous day, accompanied by Jenkins and several other ranchers who intended to testify if needed. They stayed at a modest hotel near the courthouse, rising early to prepare for the day ahead. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they walked toward the imposing stone building, Josephine's hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. She considered the question. "Strangely, no. Whatever happens today, we've already won something important. We stood up to a bully. We didn't let fear rule us." Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with admiration for this remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. "Your father would be proud." "I think he would," she agreed softly. "And I think he would have liked you, Thomas Tucker." The courtroom was crowded when they entered. News of the case had spread, and curious onlookers filled the public benches. Stanton was there, notebook ready. Marshal Collins sat near the front, his presence a reminder of federal authority. On the other side of the aisle sat Holloway, flanked by two expensively dressed lawyers. His face was set in lines of cold determination, his eyes narrowing when he spotted Thomas and Josephine. Judge Wilson entered, and the court was called to order. What followed was less dramatic than Thomas had anticipated, but no less significant. Holloway's lawyers presented their case first, producing the document they claimed proved Edmund Faulkner had sold his land before his death. Judge Wilson examined it carefully, then asked to see Josephine's original deed. After comparing the two, he called for expert testimony from a handwriting analyst who had examined both documents. "In my professional opinion," the analyst stated, "the signature on Mr. Holloway's document is not consistent with authenticated examples of Edmund Faulkner's handwriting. It appears to be an imitation, and not a particularly skilled one." Holloway's lawyers objected vigorously, but the judge overruled them. Next came testimony from the county clerk who had registered the original deed, confirming its authenticity. By midday, the direction of the proceedings was clear. Judge Wilson called a recess for lunch, during which Holloway could be seen in heated discussion with his lawyers in a corner of the courthouse lobby. When court reconvened, there was a surprise. Holloway's lead lawyer rose and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented this morning, my client wishes to withdraw his claim to the Faulkner property. While he maintains that he acted in good faith, based on documents he believed to be legitimate, Mr. Holloway has no desire to pursue a lengthy legal battle over this relatively small parcel of land." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Is this accurate, Mr. Holloway?" Holloway stood, his face a mask of controlled fury. "It is, Your Honor. My lawyers advise me that continuing this case would be counterproductive, I see." The judge turned to Josephine. Miss Faulkner, it appears your title to the property will stand unchallenged. Do you wish to pursue any damages against Mr. Holloway for the occupation of your land and any resulting harm? Josephine rose, her expression serene despite the tension in the room. No, Your Honor. I have my home back. That's all I ever wanted. Judge Wilson nodded. Very well. This court finds that the land in question legally belongs to Josephine Faulkner as inherited from her father, Edmund Faulkner. Mr. Holloway and his associates are permanently enjoined from interfering with Miss Faulkner's property or person. He banged his gavel. Case dismissed. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Holloway approached Thomas and Josephine, his lawyers hovering anxiously behind him. You've won this round, he said, his voice low and controlled despite the anger in his eyes. Enjoy it while you can. The valley isn't big enough for all of us. Actually, it is, Thomas replied calmly, if you're willing to live as a neighbor rather than a conqueror. Holloway's laugh was cold. Always the idealist, Tucker, just like your father. He turned to leave, then paused. Don't think this is over. There are many ways to wage war. And many ways to make peace, Josephine countered. The choice is yours, Mr. Holloway. Holloway didn't reply, merely turned on his heel and strode away, his lawyers scrambling to keep up. Jenkins approached as Holloway disappeared through the courthouse doors. Don't let him rattle you, the older man advised. Men like that, their power depends on fear. Without it, they're just angry old men with too much money and too little conscience. Do you think he'll cause more trouble? Josephine asked. Jenkins considered. He might try, but he's on notice now. The federal judge is watching him. The newspapers are watching him. And every independent rancher in the valley is watching him. He smiled. Even Holloway isn't foolish enough to fight those odds. Outside the courthouse, they were met by Stanton, eager for quotes for his final article on the case. As Jenkins spoke with the reporter, Thomas drew Josephine aside to a quiet corner of the courthouse steps. So, he said, taking both her hands in his, it's really over. The land is yours free and clear. Ours, she corrected softly, if you still want it to be. Thomas's heart swelled with emotion. I meant what I said about putting down roots, Josephine, about finding a place worth staying for. He paused, gathering his courage. But it's not just the land I want to share, it's a life with you. Josephine's eyes brightened with unshed tears. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Thomas Tucker? He smiled, releasing one of her hands to reach into his pocket, producing a simple gold band. I bought this yesterday. It's not fancy, but it's perfect, she interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. Josephine Faulkner, Thomas said, his own voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. Will you marry me, build a life with me on that land your father loved so much? Yes, she whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks even as she smiled. Yes, I will. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the courthouse bells began to toll the hour an appropriate accompaniment, Thomas thought, to the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. Jenkins and the other ranchers insisted on celebrating the court victory and the engagement that evening. They gathered at a restaurant near their hotel, raising glasses in toast after toast to justice, to neighbors standing together, and to the future of the young couple whose love had been forged in the crucible of adversity. Late that night, as they stood in the hotel hallway outside their respective rooms, Thomas kissed Josephine tenderly. 1 month, he murmured against her lips. 1 month until you become Mrs. Tucker, she smiled, her eyes luminous in the dim hallway light. Not too long to wait. Long enough, he countered with a grin, but worth it. They returned to the valley the following day, the train journey filled with plans for the future repairs to complete on the homestead, crops to plant, cattle to purchase. Jenkins offered Thomas a herd of young steers as an early wedding present, the foundation for their own ranching operation. Every young couple needs a start, the older man said gruffly when Thomas tried to protest the generosity. And every good ranch needs good neighbors. I'm just ensuring both. The month before their wedding passed swiftly. Thomas moved into the small bunkhouse near Josephine's cabin, propriety maintained until they could be properly married. Each day they worked side by side, restoring the homestead to its former condition and preparing for their shared future. Word came from Denver that Holloway had left the territory, traveling east on extended business. Whether this meant his defeat was truly accepted or merely that he was regrouping for future battles remained to be seen. But for now, peace had returned to the valley. The wedding took place on a perfect autumn day, with the aspen trees turning gold against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. Reverend Powell performed the ceremony in the small church in Willow Creek, which was filled to capacity with well-wishers, ranchers and cowboys, townspeople and travelers, all drawn by the story of love and perseverance that had captured imaginations throughout the territory. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Winters had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair. Thomas, in a new suit that felt strange after years in cowhand's clothing, watched her walk down the aisle on Jenkins's arm with a sense of wonder and gratitude that still hadn't faded when he spoke his vows. "I, Thomas, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice clear and sure in the hushed church. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Reverend Powell pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests nearly raised the church roof. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter. Stanton was there, having traveled from Denver specifically for the occasion. "The perfect ending to my series of articles," he told them with a wink. "Love triumphant over greed, justice prevailing against corruption. My readers are enthralled." As dusk fell, Thomas and Josephine slipped away from the festivities, riding together toward their homestead, their home now, in truth as well as in law. The cabin glowed with warm lamplight as they approached, having been prepared earlier by Mrs. Winters and some of the other women from neighboring ranches. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, new linens on the bed, a hot meal waiting on the stove. Thomas lifted Josephine from her horse, carrying her across the threshold with a smile that matched her own. "Welcome home, Mrs. Tucker," he said softly. "Our home," she agreed, her arms around his neck, her eyes filled with love. "Forever." 5 years later, Thomas stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Josephine showed their 3-year-old son, Edmund, how to collect eggs from the chicken coop. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the sounds of cattle in the nearby pasture and the rhythmic creaking of the windmill that Thomas had built their second year on the ranch. The Lazy T, as they had named their growing operation, had prospered beyond their early hopes. The original homestead had been expanded with the purchase of adjacent land when a neighbor retired to live with his daughter in Denver. Their herd had grown from Jenkins's initial gift to over 500 head, with a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Kansas City. Life hadn't been without challenges. Drought had tested them their second summer. A particularly harsh winter had claimed some of their cattle in their third year. And Holloway, true to his word, had not entirely abandoned his vendetta, though his methods had become more subtle, attempting to block their access to certain markets, spreading rumors among potential buyers. But with each challenge, they had grown stronger, both as ranchers and as a couple, and they hadn't faced any of it alone. The alliance of independent ranchers that had formed to help Josephine keep her land had evolved into a formal association, providing mutual support against both natural disasters and human obstacles, like Holloway. Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of a rider, Jenkins, now showing his age but still straight-backed in the saddle. "Morning, Tucker," the older man called as he dismounted. "Brought the mail from town." He handed Thomas several letters and a newspaper. "And some news you'll want to hear." "Good news or bad?" Thomas asked, offering Jenkins a seat on the porch and pouring him coffee from the pot Josephine kept warm for visitors. "Depends on your perspective," Jenkins replied with a twinkle in his eye. "Holloway's selling out. Lock, stock, and barrel, moving back east permanently from what I hear." Thomas sat up straighter. "You're certain?" Jenkins nodded. "Got it straight from his foreman. The whole operation's for sale, 20,000 acres, buildings, cattle, the works." "Wonder what brought that on," Thomas mused. "Holloway never struck me as the type to admit defeat. Word is his health is failing, and his son has no interest in ranching, prefers city life in Boston or New York. Jenkins sipped his coffee. Regardless of the reason, it's the end of an era in this valley. Thomas looked out across the land. He and Josephine had worked so hard to build into a thriving ranch the expanded pastures, the new barn, the fields of alfalfa waving in the breeze. In the distance, Josephine was returning from the chicken coop, Edmund skipping beside her with a basket of eggs, their daughter Sarah, just a year old, balanced on her hip. An end, Thomas agreed, but also a beginning. Jenkins followed his gaze, smiling at the approaching family. "You've done well, son, both of you, built something that will last." "We had help," Thomas said sincerely, "friends who stood with us when it mattered most." Josephine reached the porch, her face glowing with health and happiness. "Mr. Jenkins, what a lovely surprise." As she settled beside Thomas, little Sarah reaching for her father's familiar arms, Jenkins shared his news about Holloway's departure. Josephine's expression was thoughtful as she absorbed the information. "So he's really leaving," she said. "After all this time, does it bother you?" Thomas asked. That he never had to answer for what he did, the forged documents, the intimidation, all of it. Josephine considered the question, looking out over the land that had been the center of so much conflict. "I think he has answered for it, in his way. He's leaving the valley he tried so hard to control. We're still here on the land he couldn't take." She smiled, reaching for Thomas's hand. "That feels like justice to me." Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Wise words, Mrs. Tucker." He finished his coffee and stood. "I should be getting back. Just wanted to deliver the news in person." As he mounted his horse, he added, "Association meeting on Saturday. Might want to start thinking about who we'd prefer to see by Holloway's spread. Better the devil we know than one we don't." After Jenkins had ridden away, Thomas and Josephine sat together on the porch, Sarah now asleep in her father's arms, Edmund playing with wooden blocks at their feet. The piece of the moment of their life together felt like a gift neither had dared hope for when they first met that desperate day with Holloway's men in pursuit. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" Josephine asked softly. "How close we came to losing everything?" Thomas smiled, remembering. "I think about how I found everything," he corrected gently. "A home, a purpose." His gaze met hers, filled with the love that had only deepened over the years. "The woman I was meant to find, even with all the danger, the uncertainty, especially with those things," he said. "They showed us what we were capable of together." He leaned over to kiss her, a tender gesture that still held the passion of their early days, and I wouldn't change a moment of it. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had fought for and won, Thomas Tucker held his family close and gave silent thanks for the twist of fate that had led him to that rocky embankment 5 years ago, where a desperate woman with courage in her heart had changed his life forever. "She's mine forever," he had once declared to Holloway's men when they tried to take Josephine away. The words had been born of defiance then, a declaration of protection. Now, with Josephine beside him and their children in their arms, those same words were a promise fulfilled not of possession, but of partnership, not of ownership, but of shared destiny on the land they both loved. Forever had only just begun.